Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest professions. A man stands in a crowded medieval square, axe in hand, about to take a life in the name of justice. The crowd watches in horrified fascination. But here's what they won't tell you in the history books. After he delivers that fatal blow, this man will walk home through empty streets. No one will meet his eyes. Shopkeepers will refuse to sell him bread. His children will grow up knowing they can never escape his shadow, never marry into a normal family, never live without the stain of his profession. He is the most essential man in the justice system, yet society treats him like a plague carrier. How did medieval executioners live with this impossible contradiction? What was it really like to be the man everyone needed but nobody wanted? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a world of blood, isolation, and shocking secrets. Now, before we step into this shadow world together, I have a small favor to ask. If this story intrigues you, if you're curious about these dark corners of history, would you consider subscribing? It helps more than you might think, and if something I share tonight resonates with you, a like would genuinely make my day. I love reading your comments too, so tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? What draws you to these medieval mysteries? Your thoughts mean everything to me. All right, let's set the mood. Dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background sound, get comfortable, and let's walk together through the blood-stained streets of medieval Europe. Let me take you to Nuremberg, Germany, February 12th. 1584. The town square is packed, but not for celebration. 5 young men stand on the scaffold. The eldest is 22, the youngest, 13 years old. Their crime, theft, burglary. Today they might get community service. In medieval times they get the rope. The man who will hang them is Franz Schmidt, 29 years old. He keeps a diary, recording every execution with stark simplicity. 5 thieves who had burgled and stolen. The eldest were 22, 17, 16, and 15 years old, the youngest 13 years, all 5 hanged here at Nuremberg. No emotion, no judgment, just facts. But here's the thing that haunts me. Franz Schmidt never chose this life. His father never chose it either. Picture 1553, a Bavarian village. Heinrich Schmidt is an ordinary woodsman. Then one day the tyrannical Margrave Albrecht II needs 3 men executed. He has no executioner, so he scans the crowd and points. You will do it. He's pointing at Heinrich. Heinrich probably begged, probably protested. But you don't refuse a Margrave. So Heinrich kills 3 strangers, and in that moment, his life ends. Not physically, but in every way that matters. Because now he's an executioner, and that stain never washes off. From that day forward, Heinrich and his entire family are marked. They cannot enter church through the main door. They must live on the town's edge. Parents warn their children away from the Schmidt children. And Heinrich's son Franz inherits not a profession, but a curse. This is what you need to understand. Medieval executioners weren't volunteers, they weren't sadists. They were ordinary people trapped by fate, and once you were in, there was no escape. Now you might ask, why didn't they just refuse? Because society desperately needed executioners. Justice required public punishment, visible consequences for crime. Without executioners, the legal system collapsed. But here's the paradox. Everyone believed that taking life, even a guilty life, contaminated you, made you impure, less than human. Medieval society couldn't reconcile the sacred nature of life with the necessity of execution. So they created a class of people to bear that burden, then pretended they didn't exist. They called them dishonorable trades, gravediggers, butchers, cesspool cleaners, and at the very bottom, executioners. In German, Unehrliche Leute meant dishonorable people. This label destroyed everything. You couldn't join guilds, hold office, or testify in court. Your word was worthless. And this shame? It passed to your children and your children's children. In Scandinavia, executioners had their ears cut off so everyone could identify them. In other regions, they were branded on the forehead. Their profession was written on their faces. They couldn't enter city gates, couldn't touch other people at markets, couldn't sit with regular citizens in church. Where did they live? On the town's outskirts among prostitutes, lepers, and the desperately poor. Executioners existed in a shadow world, parallel to but never touching normal society. And marriage? No respectable family would allow it, so executioners married executioners. Over time, this created vast dynasties. The Guillaume family in Paris, executioners for over a century. The Sanson family, who followed them for nearly 200 years. The Delembo dynasty across Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. When historians studied these family networks, they found something remarkable. Executioner genealogies resembled aristocratic family trees. They cared deeply about lineage, property, and passing down knowledge and tools. And the children. Imagine being born into this. You didn't choose it. But from childhood, you knew you were different. Other children avoided you. You'd watch your father leave for the scaffold, hear the crowd roar, see him return silently, washing blood from his hands. And you'd know this would become your life too. Your father would start training you young. First, sharpening blades, testing ropes, then practice. Apprentice executioners started with pumpkins, roughly the size of a human head. Once you could cleanly decapitate a pumpkin, you graduated to animals, stray dogs usually. Learning the angle, the force, the precision, Franz Schmidt practiced in his father's backyard. Pumpkins, then dogs, then people. Can you imagine that progression? What does it do to someone psychologically? Executioners had to compartmentalize to separate killing from their sense of self as moral beings. Because despite society's judgment, most saw themselves as servants of justice. They weren't murderers. They held legal warrants, signed by proper authorities, protecting them from murder charges. What they did was justice, not murder. But try explaining that to the children who wouldn't play with your kids, to the innkeepers who refused you shelter, to the world that needed you but despised you. This is the executioner's paradox. Society absolutely required them. Without them, justice couldn't function, order couldn't be maintained. But the very act that made them necessary made them untouchable. It reveals something profound about human nature. We need someone to do our dirty work, to bear violence on our behalf. But we don't want to acknowledge them. We want them in shadows, appearing when needed, then vanishing. Executioners lived with this contradiction daily. They were state officials with impressive titles. Paris's executioner was Monsieur de Paris, the gentleman of Paris. But titles didn't buy respect. Franz Schmidt eventually became wealthy, owned a large house, was sought for medical advice. But his children remained marked. His family name stayed stained. Think about the psychological weight. Every morning you wake up and you're an executioner. That's your identity. Not father, husband, or Christian first. Just executioner. That's how everyone sees you. That's all you're allowed to be. Yet as we'll discover, executioners were so much more. They were healers, businessmen, family men who loved and hoped for their children's futures. They were human beings forced into an inhuman role, trying to find dignity where none was offered. Franz Schmidt's diary, those emotionless entries are heartbreaking when you think deeply about them. They represent a man desperately trying to stay detached, to remain sane, to survive the weight of what he's done. 5 young men hanged, the youngest 13. All Franz allows himself to write: the date, the method, the ages, nothing more. But there was more. There had to be. Franz Schmidt was human. And that's what makes his story and every executioner's story so compelling and tragic. I want you to sit with that paradox. The executioner, essential yet untouchable, needed yet despised, human yet treated as less than human. In our next part, we'll discover how entire bloodlines became trapped in this profession for generations. We'll explore the curse of inheritance that followed these families. And here's something surprising. Some executioners built lives of considerable wealth. But we'll also uncover their secret side hustles, because executions didn't happen often enough to pay the bills. What did executioners do the rest of the time? The answer adds layers to this already complex story. Stay with me. We're just beginning to peel back the mystery surrounding these shadow figures of medieval justice. Their story is a mirror held up to society's deepest contradictions, and there's so much more waiting to be discovered. So we've explored the paradox of executioners. But here's the question burning in your mind. If this profession was so despised, how did anyone become an executioner? Who would voluntarily choose this life? The answer is darker than you might imagine. Most didn't choose. They inherited it, like a curse passing from father to son. Spring, 1573, Bavaria. 18-year-old Franz Schmidt stands in his father's backyard, sword in hand. At his feet, a stray dog, restrained and waiting. This isn't random cruelty. This is Franz's final examination before officially beginning his career as executioner. Becoming an executioner wasn't like applying for a normal job. For Franz, this path was decided 20 years earlier, when his father Heinrich was forced to execute 3 men. The son inherits the father's trade. Always. That's how it worked. There were 3 pathways into this profession. None involved anyone raising their hand voluntarily. The first and most common, family inheritance. If your father was an executioner, you became one. No discussion. The logic was brutal but practical. Who else would do it? Society had already cast out your family. Guilds wouldn't accept you. Respectable families wouldn't marry you. So you picked up your father's axe and carried on. This created what historians call execution dynasties. Not just father-to-son transitions, but vast family networks spanning generations and entire regions. Take the Guillaume family in Paris. Jean Guillaume became executioner in 1594. By the time his dynasty ended, over 200 future executioners would trace their lineage back to him. 200 lives predetermined, futures written in blood. When Jean Guillaume died, he'd become wealthy enough for an elaborate funeral. Imagine that scene, an executioner's funeral, attended by other executioners, mourning a man the rest of society pretended didn't exist. Tragic and defiant simultaneously. The Guillaumes were succeeded by the even more famous Sanson family. From 1688 to 1847, 6 generations of Sansons served as executioners of Paris. 6 generations. A baby born into this family in 1700 would grow up knowing his future was sealed. He would kill for the state. His children would kill for the state. His grandchildren would kill for the state. The most famous was Charles-Henri Sanson. His very first execution, robber François d'Amiens, who attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. Decades later, Charles-Henri would execute King Louis XVI during the Revolution. His first victim was a would-be king killer. His most famous victim was an actual king. The irony is staggering. Charles-Henri executed 2,918 people in his career. Nearly 3,000 lives ended by one man's hand. He also oversaw the very first guillotine execution, an executioner dynasty bringing humane death to France. Britain had the Pierrepoint dynasty, Henry, Thomas, and Albert, serving from 1902 to 1956. Germany had the Dallenborg family working across Switzerland, Austria, and the Netherlands. Each region had its cursed families carrying the burden of state violence. Here's what surprised me. These families didn't just accept their fate passively. They built networks, marriage alliances, training systems. Historians studying executioner genealogies found structures remarkably similar to aristocratic family trees. They cared about lineage, property, maintaining position. Why? Because once you were an executioner, you wanted your children to be successful executioners, not from love of the work, but because what else could they be? So you trained them meticulously, passing down tools, knowledge, techniques, secrets of the trade. Let's talk about that training because it's both fascinating and disturbing. How do you teach someone to kill? You start around age 15 or 16. First the tools, sharpening blades, testing ropes, maintaining axes, practical skills like any craft. But then comes practice, and this gets dark. You can't practice on people. So medieval executioners developed a progression from inanimate objects to living beings. Step 1. Pumpkins, roughly the size and shape of a human head. Apprentices spent weeks practicing their swing, achieving clean single-stroke decapitation. Every time, without fail. Step 2. Animals, usually stray dogs, sometimes larger animals. This is where psychological conditioning began. You had to kill a living thing without hesitation, without mercy, with cold efficiency. Imagine what that does to a teenager. Killing animals as practice for killing people. Some struggled, some hesitated. But if you wanted to survive, you learned to overcome those hesitations. Franz Schmidt practiced this way. After mastering pumpkins and dogs, he was ready for his first human execution. And here's something that really gets me. Imagine that first time. You've practiced on vegetables and animals. You know the mechanics. But now there's a person in front of you. A real human being, probably terrified, possibly begging for mercy or forgiveness. And you have to shut down every natural instinct for compassion and do your job. If he performed well, executed cleanly and professionally, he'd be addressed as Master, Master Franz, a title of dark respect. This masterpiece execution was crucial. In medieval Germany, executioners were skilled tradesmen. Like carpenters or blacksmiths producing a masterpiece for guild recognition, executioners had to prove skill with a flawless beheading. The second pathway. Criminals offered a choice. Imagine you're convicted awaiting execution. Someone offers, become the executioner and you live. Some chose death. Others, desperate, accepted. They traded their execution for a lifetime executing others. This didn't save them from social death. Still outcast, still marked, still despised, but alive. The third pathway. Pure, grinding poverty. When you're starving, when your children are starving, even a despised profession looks acceptable. Because executioners were paid well. Royal executioners earned generous salaries. High-profile executions meant bonuses. Positions came with tax exemptions. No head tax, property tax, military contributions, or excise taxes. Some received free housing. Think about what this meant. An ordinary labourer might work himself to exhaustion for barely enough to eat. A craftsman in a guild earned decent money but had expenses, taxes, fees. An executioner, he could potentially earn more than both, with fewer expenses. The state needed these men, so they paid them well enough to make the social death almost bearable. A perverse situation. The most despised profession was actually lucrative. If you could stomach the isolation, the stigma, you could achieve wealth. But here's the catch that made it a true trap. That wealth was worthless for everything that mattered. Wealth didn't buy acceptance. An executioner could own the largest house and still be refused market service. could have gold rivaling merchants and still have his children barred from playing with others. You could be rich and still eat alone, wealthy and still die alone, successful and still watch your daughter unable to find a husband who'd accept her. Let me share one case illustrating this trap. 1664, 10-year-old Louis Desmarest became executioner of Paris. His father died, passing the title to his son. Obviously, a 10-year-old couldn't perform executions, so regents filled in, but his appointment sent a clear message. This was family business. Not just anyone could be executioner. It had to be someone already marked, someone whose blood carried the stain. Louis's case was unusual because the curse ran on both sides. His mother belonged to the Guillaume dynasty. This child had executioner blood from both parents. He never stood a chance of being anything else. That's what you need to understand. For most executioners, this wasn't choice. It was a curse passed through generations, a trap entire families couldn't escape. Sons watched fathers, learned the trade they hated, passed it to their sons, who'd pass it to theirs. Franz Schmidt spent his career trying to break this cycle. He became wealthy, respected in his way, sought after as a healer, but his children were still marked. At age 70, retired, he spent years petitioning Bavaria's authorities, not for himself, for his children. Please release them from this curse. Let them pursue normal lives, trades, marriages. Miraculously, he succeeded. Franz Schmidt's children were freed, granted the right to pursue other careers, marry into respectable families, live without that stain. One of the few happy endings in this dark story, but Franz's success was exceptionally rare. Most executioner families couldn't break free. Generation after generation, they carried the axe, tightened the noose, lived on society's margins. The curse continued, sometimes for centuries. When you think about medieval executioners, remember, most never chose this life. They inherited it, were trapped by it, tried to survive it. Born into marked families, from childhood knowing their fate was sealed. Coming up next, we'll explore just how marked these men were. The specific ways society labelled executioners, the clothing they were forced to wear, the brutal physical marks sometimes carved into their bodies, the separate spaces they inhabited. Because society didn't just want to know who executioners were, they wanted everyone to know instantly and permanently. The methods they used are more shocking than you expect. Stay with me. The deeper we go, the more we understand about the humans who inhabited this world and the societies that created them. You know what's fascinating about medieval society? They didn't just dislike executioners. They needed everyone to know who these men were at all times. Visual identification wasn't enough. They wanted permanent marks, impossible to hide, impossible to escape. Scandinavia, 16th century. A man becomes an executioner. Before he can begin his work, authorities hold him down. With a sharp blade, they cut off both his ears. Both ears, gone, forever. Why? So that even if he tried to blend in, even if he moved to a new town, even if he wore fine clothes, his mutilated ears would give him away instantly. The executioner's identity was carved into his body. Can you imagine? Every conversation, people's eyes drawn to the sides of your head, children pointing, adults whispering, your own body broadcasting your shame. Scandinavia wasn't unique. In parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, they used branding. Hot irons pressed against the executioner's forehead, burning a mark into the skin. Some brands were symbols. Others were letters indicating the trade. The mark would scar over, leaving permanent discoloration. Think about the psychology. You're already doing society's darkest work, already isolated, already feared, and then society literally writes its judgment on your face. You become a walking advertisement for your own degradation. But physical mutilation was just one method. Many regions used clothing regulations instead, which in some ways were even more insidious because they required daily, visible compliance. In various German cities, executioners wore specific colours nobody else could wear, often red and yellow, colours associated with dishonourable trades. Some cities mandated particular hats or coloured staffs. Others required cloaks with distinctive patterns. The clothing served multiple purposes. It identified the executioner, but it also psychologically reinforced his outsider status. Every morning, dressing meant consciously putting on garments that proclaimed his shame. He couldn't blend in. His clothes shouted his identity before he spoke. Picture this. You're an executioner's child, maybe 10 years old. You need to go to the market with your father. He puts on his mandated red and yellow cloak. You see the way he pauses before opening the door, takes a breath, steels himself for the stares and whispers that will follow, and you learn, very young, that your father isn't just different. Society has made sure everyone knows he's different. Even more restrictive, many cities controlled where executioners could walk. Main gates, forbidden. Executioners use side entrances, back alleys, paths designated for refuse removal. The metaphor was brutally clear. Executioners were garbage, so they used garbage routes. Some towns banned executioners from certain streets entirely. If they needed to cross town, they took circuitous routes, adding hours to simple errands. And if an executioner encountered someone on a narrow street, guess who stepped aside, pressed against the wall, averted their eyes? The executioner always. Markets presented special challenges. Executioners needed to buy food, but many vendors refused direct dealings, so a system developed. The executioner would point at items. The merchant would set them on the ground. The executioner would place money on the ground. Neither touched what the other had touched, like handling contaminated materials. Some brought wives or children to shop, hoping family members might face less discrimination. But often stigma extended to entire families. Shopkeepers might still refuse service, charge higher prices, or make them wait until all respectable customers were served. Churches presented perhaps the most painful exclusion. Medieval people took religion seriously. Church attendance was central to community life and salvation. But executioners were seen as spiritually contaminated, touched by death, impure. Many churches refused them entry entirely. Others had specific rules about where executioners could stand. Some places had a door at the back called the executioner's door or sinner's entrance. Executioners slipped in through this door, stood in segregated areas, and left immediately after services without socializing. During communion, priests sometimes refused to serve executioners, or served them only after everyone else. Even in God's house, even in a religion preaching forgiveness, executioners were lesser beings. Imagine the spiritual anguish. You're trying to be a good Christian, seeking forgiveness for lives you've taken in justice's name. But the institution preaching God's love treats you as unworthy of that love. You watch other parishioners receive communion, embrace, share fellowship. You stand alone in your corner, waiting until everyone else has been served. And sometimes, when the priest finally approaches you, you can see the reluctance in his eyes, the way he tries not to let his fingers touch yours when he places the wafer in your hand. Housing revealed the starkest spatial segregation. Towns absolutely didn't want executioners living among respectable citizens. So executioners were housed on town edges, as far from the center as possible. Their neighbors, prostitutes, also considered impure. Lepers, physically contaminated and feared. The desperately poor with no choice about housing. Criminal elements operating in society's shadows. The executioner's neighborhood was a geography of shame, a physical manifestation of social rejection. Some cities gave executioners houses near slaughterhouses or tanneries, smelly, unpleasant locations nobody wanted. The symbolism was clear. Executioners dealt in death and blood, so they should live near places where animals were killed and processed. Others lived near town walls, sometimes in converted towers, far from respectable areas but close to execution grounds, also typically located outside the main town, and even burial separated them. Executioners had separate graveyards, often small plots near execution grounds. Graves were unmarked or marked with simple stones, no elaborate funerals, no consecrated ground with the community. Even in death they remained separate. While merchants might have ornate tombstones with epitaphs and religious symbols, executioner graves were plain. The message extended beyond death. Even your bones are contaminated. Some families passed down stories of being turned away from town cemeteries. A loved one would die, and they'd be told, "You can't bury them here. Your kind has a place outside the walls." Imagine the pain, the humiliation of rejection even in grief. Did executioners ever fight back against these restrictions? Rarely. The power imbalance was too great. They needed the authorities who employed them, the protection of legal warrants, the payment. Complaining too loudly risked losing everything, but there were subtle forms of resistance. Some wealthy executioners bought the finest houses they could, even in marginal areas. They furnished them lavishly, displayed wealth conspicuously. A quiet way of saying, "You can force me to live here, but you can't force me to live poorly." Others built networks with other executioner families, creating parallel societies with their own rules, hierarchies, sense of honor. If the regular world wouldn't accept them, they'd build their own. Some, like Franz Schmidt, achieved such professional excellence that people had to respect them, even if they couldn't accept them. Franz became known as both skilled executioner and healer, his medical knowledge rivaling trained physicians. People who wouldn't sit next to him in church would come to him when sick. But even Franz, wealthy and respected in his way, couldn't escape fundamental reality. He was marked. His profession was written in invisible but indelible ink. His children inherited that mark. His grandchildren would have too if he hadn't fought to break the cycle. There's particular cruelty in how medieval society handled executioners. They created a class to do desperately needed work, then punish those people for doing it. They carved marks into bodies, mandated clothing restrictions, controlled movement, segregated housing, separated burial grounds. Every aspect of an executioner's life was regulated, restricted, marked. And here's what strikes me most. These weren't random cruelties. This was systematic effort to maintain boundaries, keep executioners in their place, ensure death's contamination didn't spread to the wider community. Medieval people genuinely believed contact with executioners could taint you, damage your honor, compromise your standing. It's a fascinating window into how humans create and maintain social hierarchies. We need certain work done, but we don't want to acknowledge the people doing it. So we mark them, separate them, pretend they're fundamentally different. It's easier to use someone's services if you convince yourself they're not really like you, but they were. That's what makes this system so tragic. Executioners were human beings with families, fears, hopes, dreams. They laughed, loved, prayed, worked, aged, and died like everyone else. But society needed them to be monsters, or at least something less than fully human. So it created systems to make that fiction real. Next, we're stepping inside an executioner's mind through the most detailed primary source we have, Franz Schmidt's diary. Over 45 years, he recorded 361 executions and hundreds of other punishments. But his diary reveals far more than death lists. It shows us how a human being coped with inhuman work, how he maintained sanity and sense of self, while society treated him as less than human. The diary is both heartbreaking and fascinating, giving insights into executioner psychology we can't get anywhere else. Stay with me. What if I told you one of the most remarkable documents from the medieval period wasn't written by a king, scholar, or priest, but by an executioner, and that this document gives us a clearer window into daily justice, crime, and punishment than almost any other source from that era? This is the story of Franz Schmidt's diary, and it's going to change how you think about executioners. From 1573 to 1617, Master Franz kept meticulous records: 45 years, 361 executions, 345 lesser punishments, floggings, amputations, brandings, every single one documented with precise details: date, method, crime, name of the condemned. Here's what makes this extraordinary. Franz Schmidt wasn't supposed to be literate. Most executioners couldn't read or write. They were considered too low, too dishonorable for education, but Franz could write. And what he left us is priceless. Let me read you an actual entry. June 21st, 1593. Kunz-Kretner of Obermassfeld cut off the fingers of his right hand and flogged him out of town because he had pretended to be a town piper and a night watchman from Munich. That's it. No emotion, no commentary, just facts. A man pretended to be something he wasn't. Franz cut off his fingers and expelled him. Next entry. Another one. September 12th, 1595. Georg Karl, who called himself a student but was a murderer and a thief, broken on the wheel. One of the most brutal execution methods ever devised. The condemned person is tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner uses an iron bar to methodically break their bones limb by limb. The wheel is then displayed publicly with the broken body still attached, left to die slowly over hours or days. And Franz records this with the same emotional distance as a grocery list. Here's what's haunting. It's what's not there. 361 people died by Franz's hand, and he never once writes about how he felt. Never mentions nightmares, guilt, regret. Never says, "Today was particularly difficult," or "This execution troubled me." Nothing. Just names, crimes, methods, dates. Is Franz cold, unfeeling, some medieval psychopath? I don't think so. This diary represents something else, a coping mechanism, a way to stay sane while doing work that would destroy most people psychologically. If Franz allowed himself to feel the full weight of every execution, to dwell on each person's fear, their final words, their family's grief, he'd go mad. So instead, he creates distance, turns human beings into entries. Living people become data points. Their deaths become administrative records. It's emotional survival, and honestly heartbreaking when you understand it that way. May 18th, 1591. Franz documents executing Hans Fröschel. What's remarkable is we have an illustration in the margin of the court record showing Franz performing this execution. It's the only surviving fully reliable portrait we have of Franz Schmidt at work. Looking at that drawing, you see a man focused professional carrying out his duty. Not a monster, not a sadist, just a tradesman doing his trade, however dark. July 6th, 1600. Barbara Waichelin of this place, drowned because she continually committed adultery and at length strangled her own child. Here's something important. Franz notes drowning was the prescribed punishment, but in later years he became increasingly uncomfortable with drowning as execution method. He thought it unnecessarily cruel and uncertain. Sometimes the condemned struggled for minutes, gasping, fighting. It wasn't clean, it wasn't professional. So Franz began advocating for commuting drowning sentences to beheading. and remarkably authorities listened. By later in his career, most drowning sentences in Nuremberg were changed to execution by sword. Franz's professional judgment carried weight. The executioner was advising the court on how to kill more humanely. Think about that irony. August 23, 1593. Margaret Steinler of Offenhausen, otherwise known as the Spielkundel, who had broken the ban 8 times, had her fingers cut off. Margaret shows up in Franz's diary after being flogged and expelled. Then she returned, broke the ban again and again, and finally had her fingers amputated. Medieval justice escalation, first expulsion, then physical punishment, then potentially death. What was Margaret's crime? Probably illegal begging, prostitution, or vagrancy. The record doesn't specify, but whatever it was, Margaret kept doing it. 8 times she broke the ban. 8 times she risked everything to return. Why? Maybe nowhere else to go. Maybe children there. Maybe Nuremberg was home, the only home she knew, and she couldn't stay away even knowing what would happen. Franz doesn't speculate, he just records the punishment. But reading between the lines, you feel the tragedy. Now, the most disturbing entry in the entire diary. February 12th, 1584. 5 thieves who had burgled and stolen. The eldest were 22, 17, 16, and 15 years old. The youngest 13 years. All 5 hanged here at Nuremberg. 13 years old hanged for theft. In our world, a 13-year-old is in middle school, still a child. In Franz's world, a 13-year-old thief was a criminal deserving of death, and Franz hanged all 5 in one day. 5 executions, one after another, the youngest barely a teenager. Franz records this without comment. No, this was difficult, or the young one troubled me. Just facts. 5 thieves, ages listed, method, hanging, location, Nuremberg. But here's what we need to understand. Franz didn't decide these sentences. He didn't choose who lived or died. Courts made those decisions. Franz was the instrument, not the judge. Hired to carry out sentences, not question them. Yet carrying them out meant living with them. Every night Franz went home knowing what he'd done. Every morning he woke and prepared to do it again. The diary becomes a way to process this without drowning in it. By recording rather than reflecting, by documenting rather than dwelling, Franz creates psychological barrier between himself and his work. But the diary changes over time. Early entries are very brief. But as Franz's career progresses, his entries get longer, more detailed. He includes more about the crimes, circumstances, the condemned person's background. 1609. Stoffel Meyer, a butcher of Altheim, who'd committed over 20 murders. When he was born, a comet appeared in the sky. Beheaded here with the sword as a favor. Beheaded as a favor. That phrase appears repeatedly in Franz's later entries. It means beheading was considered more merciful than hanging. Hanging was slow, often botched, sometimes taking minutes of struggling. Beheading, when done well, was instant. So if a condemned person had mitigating circumstances, they might receive the favor of the sword instead of the rope. This reveals how medieval people thought about execution. Different methods carried different meanings. The method of death was part of the punishment. Hanging was shameful, beheading relatively honorable, breaking on the wheel for worst criminals, burning for heretics. Franz understood these distinctions intimately. He was, in a real sense, an expert in death. He knew exactly how much force to apply with the sword, how to position someone on the wheel for maximum effect, how to tie a noose that would kill quickly versus one causing suffering. This expertise is visible in the diary. When Franz records successful execution, there's professional pride in the precision of his language. When he records failed execution, you sense frustration. Once he notes it took multiple strokes to sever a head because his sword was poorly maintained. You can feel his embarrassment, his sense of having failed professionally, because that's what he was, a professional, not a sadist, not a monster, but a skilled tradesman who took pride in doing difficult work well. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Franz didn't just execute people. Executions were relatively rare, even in busy Nuremberg, maybe only a few per year. So what did Franz do the rest of the time? He was a healer, a medical practitioner, someone people came to when sick or injured. Historians estimate Franz provided medical consultation to approximately 15,000 patients during his career. 15,000! He healed far more people than he killed. For every execution, dozens of healings. Think about the duality. The same hands that severed heads also set broken bones. The same man who knew how to kill efficiently also knew how to cure. Franz embodied the executioner's paradox, intimately familiar with death but deeply knowledgeable about life, and the community accepted this duality. People who would never invite Franz to dinner, wouldn't sit next to him in church, crossed the street to avoid him, would still come when they needed medical help. Because Franz was good at it. His anatomy knowledge, gained through grim work, made him an effective healer. The diary ends in 1617, when Franz retired at age 62. His final entry is simple. Today I retired from the post of executioner. No reflection on his career, no final thoughts on 361 lives taken, just a simple statement. But we know what happened next. Franz spent retirement petitioning authorities to release his children from the executioner's curse, and he succeeded. His children were freed to pursue normal lives, trades, marriages. So in the end, maybe that was Franz's greatest triumph. Not the professional executions, not the medical cures, but breaking the cycle, ending the curse, giving his children the freedom he never had. The diary of Master Franz is remarkable. Clinical, precise, emotionally distant, but read carefully, with empathy, and you see the humanity behind it. A man trying to survive an impossible situation, trying to maintain sanity while doing work that would break most people. Next, we're exploring the actual art of execution, because yes, it was an art. Public executions were performances, carefully staged spectacles where one wrong move could trigger a riot. Franz and other executioners had to master not just technical skills of killing, but psychological skills of crowd management, political awareness of what their work meant to the state. It was theatre, but the stakes were life and death. Stay with me as we step onto the scaffold. Imagine you're standing in a medieval town square on execution day. Thousands have gathered. They've waited hours. The atmosphere is electric, almost festival-like. Vendors sell food. Children perch on fathers' shoulders for better views. Then the condemned is led out. Suddenly the mood shifts. The crowd goes silent. All eyes fix on one man, the executioner. This is his stage, his moment. And if he fails, if the execution goes wrong, that crowd can turn from spectators into a mob in seconds. Welcome to the art of execution. Because make no mistake, it was an art. A performance requiring not just physical skill but psychological mastery, political awareness, and nerves of absolute steel. Let's start with the most fundamental skill, precision. When we think about medieval executions, we imagine brutal, messy affairs. Sometimes they were, but a professional like Franz Schmidt, his goal was always clean, quick, efficient death. Take beheading with a sword. Sounds simple. One swing, head comes off. But the reality is far more complex. The executioner had to judge the exact angle. Too steep and the blade might get stuck in bone. Too shallow and you just wound horribly without killing. Force had to be perfectly calibrated. Follow-through had to be complete. Franz Schmidt practiced for years before his first human execution. Those pumpkins and dogs weren't just about overcoming squeamishness. It was about developing muscle memory, training your body to deliver that perfect strike every single time. And here's what most people don't realize. The condemned person had to cooperate. They had to kneel in exactly the right position, keep their neck extended, stay perfectly still. If they flinched at the last second, the execution could go horribly wrong. So part of the executioner's skill was psychological. He had to keep the condemned person calm, compliant. Some executioners spoke softly, reassuring them it would be quick, painless. Others used authoritative approaches, but the goal was always the same: maintain control. Now let's talk about what happened when executions went wrong. Because they did, frequently, and consequences could be devastating for the executioner. July 15th, 1685. London. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, is about to be executed for treason. The executioner is Jack Ketch, already infamous for botched executions. The Duke knows it. Before Ketch raises the axe, Monmouth begs him, "Do not hack me as you did my Lord Russell." Ketch promises. He raises the axe, brings it down. The Duke flinches. The blade strikes wrong. Monmouth is wounded but very much alive and conscious. The crowd gasps. Ketch strikes again and again. After 5 blows, the Duke is still moving, still making sounds. The crowd begins to riot. People are screaming, throwing things. Ketch is panicking. Finally, in desperation, he pulls out a knife and saws through the remaining tissue. 5 blows and a knife. Can you imagine? The Duke of Monmouth's execution became one of the most notorious botched executions in English history. And Jack Ketch's reputation, already poor, was destroyed forever. This is what executioners feared most: the botched execution. It wasn't just embarrassing. It could cost them their job, income, even life. Angry crowds attacked executioners who bungled their work. Some executioners were imprisoned or fined for failed executions. And the condemned? They suffered unimaginably. There are accounts of beheadings taking 10, 15, even 20 blows. Imagine the horror. You're kneeling. You feel the blade hit, but you're still conscious, still feeling everything. The executioner strikes again and again. Each blow, agony. This is why professional executioners like Franz Schmidt took their craft seriously. A clean execution was mercy. A botched execution was torture. Medieval hanging wasn't like modern hanging with trapdoor drop that breaks the neck instantly. Medieval hanging was suspension hanging. The condemned would be placed on a cart or ladder with a noose around their neck. Then the support would be removed. They'd die slowly by strangulation, often taking 10 to 20 minutes. The executioner's skill was in tying the knot, the placement of the noose, the tightness of the rope. These determined whether death would be relatively quick or agonizingly slow. A skilled executioner could tie a noose, bringing unconsciousness within minutes. An unskilled or cruel executioner could make the condemned suffer long. And here's something dark. Sometimes executioners were bribed to make death quicker or slower. Family members might pay the executioner to ensure quick death. Enemies might pay to ensure suffering. The executioner held life and death in his hands, literally, and that power could be monetized. Breaking on the wheel required tremendous skill and a strong stomach. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use an iron bar to systematically break their bones, arms, legs, ribs. The prescribed number of blows varied by region and crime. But here's what's crucial. The executioner had to know exactly where and how to strike. Too hard in the wrong place and you might kill immediately, defeating the purpose. The wheel was meant to be slow, prolonged punishment. Too soft and you didn't break the bone properly just caused horrific pain without intended effect. The skill was calibrating each blow perfectly, delivering exactly the prescribed punishment, no more, no less. All while maintaining composure before a crowd simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Now let's talk about the crowd, because managing the audience was as important as managing the execution itself. Public executions were major events. When an execution was scheduled, work stopped, schools closed, people travelled from neighbouring villages. Execution days were like festivals, complete with food vendors, entertainers, pickpockets working the crowd. The crowd came for entertainment, yes, but also for moral instruction. Executions demonstrated the power of the state, the inevitability of justice, the consequences of crime. They were morality plays, performed in the public square, and the executioner was the star of this show. Everything he did was watched, evaluated, judged. His clothing, his demeanour, his efficiency. If he appeared nervous or uncertain, the crowd would sense it. If he seemed too eager, too enthusiastic, they might turn against him, seeing cruelty rather than justice. The best executioners understood crowd psychology. They knew how to read the mood, how to pace the execution for maximum impact. There were rituals, the condemned person's final speech, the request for forgiveness, the moment of prayer. All had to be managed, timed, orchestrated. Throughout all of this, the executioner had to project authority. He couldn't show fear or hesitation. He couldn't show pleasure either. The ideal executioner was calm, professional, almost bureaucratic. He was justice personified, not a person at all. But what happened when the crowd turned ugly? If they sympathized with the condemned, if they thought the sentence unjust, if the execution went wrong, the crowd could riot. And the executioner was the most visible target. There are accounts of executioners being pelted with stones, attacked with sticks, even severely beaten by angry mobs. Some executioners had to be protected by armed guards. Others had to flee town after particularly controversial executions. This meant executioners needed awareness of the political dimensions of their work. Who was being executed mattered. A beloved local figure versus a despised criminal would draw very different crowd reactions. An execution ordered by an unpopular ruler could trigger unrest. And here's something fascinating. Executioners sometimes used their position for political resistance. If they wanted to show mercy to a condemned person they sympathized with, they might arrange for quick death when slow was prescribed. If they wanted to punish someone extra, they could make death slower than necessary. This gave executioners surprising power. Yes, they were social outcasts. Yes, they were despised. But in that moment on the scaffold they held ultimate authority. They could make death merciful or make it agony. And everyone watching knew it. Some executioners developed reputations based on their skills and approaches. There were executioners known for efficiency, like Franz Schmidt. Others were known for cruelty, like Jack Ketch. Still others were known for mercy, executioners who always tried to make death as quick as possible. These reputations mattered. They affected how condemned people reacted, how crowds responded, even how authorities viewed the executioner's work. A good reputation could mean steady employment, bribes from grateful families, even a kind of grudging respect. A bad reputation could mean unemployment, attacks, exile. Let me share one story that perfectly illustrates the skill and pressure executioners faced. Paris, 1792. Charles-Henri Sanson is preparing to execute King Louis XVI. This isn't just any execution. This is a king. The crowd is enormous. Tens of thousands. The political stakes couldn't be higher. One mistake, one hesitation, and France could erupt in civil war. Sanson has chosen to use the newly invented guillotine. It's untested on a person of this importance. The mechanism needs to work perfectly. The blade must fall clean. The king must die instantly before the crowd can react. Sanson spent the night before checking and rechecking every part of the guillotine. The blade was sharpened multiple times. The release mechanism was tested repeatedly. Nothing could go wrong. And on the day, with the king on the platform, with thousands watching, with the weight of history on his shoulders, Sanson executed the king perfectly. One clean drop. Instant death. The crowd erupted, but in celebration, not riot. Sanson had done his job. He'd killed a king with the same professional precision he'd brought to hundreds of other executions, and in doing so, he changed history. The execution of Louis XVI marked a point of no return for the French Revolution. That's the power executioners held. Not political power in the traditional sense, but the power to shape moments, to determine whether history turned on a clean blade or a botched strike. In our next section, we're exploring something I hinted at earlier, the executioner's other work. Because killing wasn't enough to make a living. Medieval executioners had to take on all sorts of additional duties, most of them as unpleasant as execution itself. We're talking about torture, waste management, dealing with dead bodies of animals and sometimes humans. The executioner was society's catch-all for any job too dirty, too dangerous, or too disturbing for anyone else. These side jobs reveal even more about how medieval society functioned and how executioners survived. Stay with me. Here's a question that probably hasn't crossed your mind. What does an executioner do on days when nobody needs executing? Because in most medieval towns, executions were relatively rare events. Maybe a handful per year, sometimes fewer. So if you're the town executioner and your income depends on this work, you've got a problem. You need other jobs to survive. And medieval society had a solution. They gave executioners every task no one else wanted to touch. Every job too dirty, too dangerous, too morally compromising. The executioner became society's universal receptacle for unpleasant work. They called it the high and low works. In French, maître des hautes et basses œuvres. The high work was execution, performed on raised platforms. The low work? That's what we're about to explore. And I'll warn you now, some of this gets grim. Let's start with torture. In medieval justice systems, torture wasn't just cruelty. It was a legal procedure used to extract confessions or information. And who administered this torture? The executioner. Medieval torture had rules. There were prescribed methods, prescribed durations, prescribed circumstances when torture could be applied. The executioner had to know all of these. He had to understand exactly how much pain to inflict without killing or permanently disabling the prisoner, unless permanent disability was part of the sentence. Think about the skill required. You had to know human anatomy intimately, know where you could apply pressure, where you could twist, where you could burn, and have the person survive to stand trial. The executioner wasn't trying to kill during torture. He was trying to extract information while keeping the prisoner alive. The tools were varied and horrifying. The rack, which stretched the body until joints dislocated. The strappado, where prisoners were suspended by their arms tied behind their backs, shoulders dislocating under their own body weight. Thumbscrews that crushed fingers. The boot that crushed feet and lower legs. The executioner had to maintain these tools, understand their operation, apply them with precision. He also had to judge the prisoner's physical condition. Could this person withstand more? Were they faking unconsciousness? Were they genuinely about to die? This was psychological work too. The executioner had to be intimidating enough that prisoners would confess from fear alone, but controlled enough that he didn't kill them prematurely. Some executioners became experts at psychological torture, using the threat of pain more than pain itself. Franz Schmidt's diary occasionally mentions torture sessions. Today applied moderate torture to extract confession. Today applied severe torture, but prisoner maintained innocence. Brief notes, emotionless as always. But behind those notes were hours of someone screaming, someone breaking, someone's body being deliberately damaged. After the torture session, the executioner often had to nurse the prisoner back to health for trial or execution. So he had to know healing as well as harming, had to know how to set dislocated joints, treat burns, prevent infection. The same hands that caused the injuries had to treat them. Now let's talk about an even more unpleasant aspect: knacker duties. A knacker dealt with dead and dying animals, and in most medieval towns this fell to the executioner. When a horse died, when livestock got sick, when someone's dog needed putting down, who got called? The executioner. He had to collect the carcass, kill the sick animal, dispose of the body. Sometimes he'd render the carcass, extracting anything useful: hide, tallow, bone meal, fat. This work was considered deeply impure. Dead animals were seen as contaminated, and anyone who touched them became contaminated too. So it made perfect sense to medieval people. The executioner is already impure from killing humans, so he might as well handle dead animals too. In some towns, executioners had exclusive right to collect animal carcasses. This could actually be lucrative. You could sell the rendered materials: tallow for candles, hides for leather, bone meal for fertilizer. But you had to do the disgusting work of processing rotting animal corpses. Imagine being an executioner's child, watching your father come home covered in blood and filth from rendering dead horses. Imagine the smell that must have clung to executioner households. This is why they lived on town edges. The stench alone would have made them unbearable neighbours. But knacker work wasn't the worst of the executioner's side jobs. That distinction probably goes to cesspool and latrine management. Medieval sanitation was, to put it mildly, problematic. Human waste had to go somewhere. Towns had cesspools, latrines, drainage systems needing regular cleaning, and this was considered the most degrading work imaginable. So naturally it often fell to executioners. Some executioners were contracted to clean out public latrines on regular schedules. They'd climb down into these pits of human waste, shovel out accumulated filth, cart it away to dump outside town. The health risks were enormous. The smell was unbearable. The social stigma was absolute. But it paid. Dirty jobs pay well when no one else will do them, so executioners added cesspool cleaning to their repertoire of unpleasant tasks. There's dark humour in this if you can find it. You're an executioner. You deal in death, in blood, in ultimate punishment, and your side job is literally shoveling waste. It's almost comedic how thoroughly medieval society managed to degrade these men. Now let's talk about another executioner duty that might surprise you: taxing prostitutes and lepers. Medieval towns regulated prostitution and tried to control where lepers could beg. Someone had to enforce these regulations, collect taxes and fines, make sure outcasts stayed in designated areas. And who better than the executioner, himself an outcast? Executioners had authority to find illegal prostitutes and tax them. If a prostitute was working without license or in a forbidden area, the executioner could confiscate her earnings and fine her. Same with lepers. If a leper was begging without permission or in the wrong location, the executioner could confiscate everything they had. This gave executioners power over other marginalized people. In some ways, it was the only power they had. They couldn't control respectable citizens, but they could control fellow outcasts. There's something particularly sad about that. The people at the bottom of society policing each other, all under the watchful eye of authorities. Executioners also managed gaming houses in some towns. Gambling was often illegal or restricted, but it happened anyway. So towns created licensed gaming houses where gambling was permitted under supervision. And who supervised? often the executioner. This meant the executioner had to be present in gambling dens, watching for cheating, collecting house fees, breaking up fights. It put him in contact with criminals, with drunks, with disreputable elements of society, which again made perfect sense to medieval people. The executioner is already disreputable, so let him deal with other disreputable people. There's a pattern here, isn't there? Every job that involved contact with things medieval society considered impure or immoral got dumped on the executioner. Death, executioner. Animal carcasses, executioner. Human waste, executioner. Prostitutes and lepers, executioner. Gambling, executioner. The executioner became a kind of social garbage disposal, taking on everything that respectable society wanted to distance itself from but still needed done. And here's what's particularly interesting. These side jobs actually gave executioners a unique position in society. They had access to places and people that others didn't. They knew secrets, they heard things, they saw things. An executioner cleaning a cesspool beneath a wealthy merchant's house might overhear conversations. An executioner taxing prostitutes would learn about their clients. An executioner managing a gaming house would know who was gambling away fortunes. This information had value. Some executioners leveraged this knowledge, not through blackmail necessarily, though that probably happened, but through being useful. If authorities needed information about criminal activity, who would know better than the executioner, who moved through society's underworld? This created a strange dynamic. The executioner was despised, yes, but he was also occasionally valuable in ways beyond his official duties. He was a source of intelligence, an unofficial spy on society's margins. Franz Schmidt, in addition to execution and healing work, probably performed many of these duties. The historical record doesn't detail all of them, but we know Nuremberg's executioner would have had responsibilities beyond the scaffold. Torture, certainly. Probably knacker work. Possibly others. Imagine your resume. Executioner, also torturer, also animal disposal specialist, also cesspool cleaner, also tax collector for outcasts, also gambling house manager. It's almost absurd, but this was the reality. The cumulative effect of all these jobs was to thoroughly separate the executioner from normal society. It wasn't just that he killed people for a living. It was that every single aspect of his work involved things that respectable people wanted nothing to do with. He touched death, blood, waste, disease, moral corruption. He was thoroughly contaminated by every medieval standard of purity. And this contamination justified the continued exclusion, the continued marking, the continued social death we talked about earlier. But here's what strikes me as particularly cruel. The executioner didn't choose these jobs. Society forced them on him. Society created a role requiring someone to do all its dirty work, then punished that person for doing it. The executioner was simultaneously essential and reviled, needed and hated. The psychological toll must have been enormous. Bad enough to take lives as part of your job, but to also torture, render dead animals, clean cesspools, police other outcasts. How do you maintain any sense of dignity? How do you not become bitter, angry, broken? Some executioners probably did break. The historical record occasionally mentions executioners who turned to crime themselves, who became violent outside official duties, who drank themselves to death. The stress, the social isolation, the moral weight, it destroyed some men. But others, like Franz Schmidt, found ways to survive. They compartmentalized. They focused on doing their jobs professionally. They built parallel lives through healing work when possible. They found meaning where they could. In our next section, we're exploring something that might seem contradictory after everything we've discussed. We're talking about the executioner as healer, because the same men who tortured and killed also cured and saved. The hands that broke bones also set them. The knowledge gained from death was used to preserve life. It's one of the most fascinating paradoxes of the executioner's existence, and it reveals something profound about human capability and about how people find redemption in impossible circumstances. Stay with me. After everything we've discussed about torture, death, and degradation, I want to share something that might shock you more than anything else. The most skilled healers in many medieval towns weren't physicians with university degrees. They were executioners. Yes, the same men who beheaded criminals and cleaned cesspools were also the people you'd go to when you broke a bone or suffered chronic pain. And here's the truly remarkable part. They were often better at healing than the trained doctors. How is this possible? How does someone who deals in death become an expert in preserving life? The answer reveals one of the most beautiful paradoxes of human experience. Let's start with Franz Schmidt. Over his 45-year career, Franz executed 361 people. But during that same period, he provided medical consultation to approximately 15,000 patients. 15,000. For every person Franz killed, he healed more than 40. Think about that ratio. If you met Franz Schmidt on the street and asked about his work, should he say, "I'm an executioner," or "I'm a healer"? By the numbers, healing was far more central to his life than killing. But which identity did medieval society recognize? Which one defined him? The executioner label stuck, of course. But Franz's reality was that he spent far more time setting broken bones than breaking them. Far more time applying salves than applying torture. Far more time saving lives than taking them. So where did this medical knowledge come from? Why were executioners particularly skilled at healing? The answer lies in anatomy. Executioners had intimate practical knowledge of the human body that university-trained physicians simply couldn't match. They knew exactly where bones connected, where major blood vessels ran, how joints articulated, where nerves were most sensitive. They learned this through their grim work. Every execution was an anatomy lesson. Every torture session revealed how the body responded to stress and pain. Every broken bone showed them the structure beneath the skin. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from textbooks. This was practical, hands-on understanding gained through direct experience. And here's something fascinating. Executioners also had access to materials that other healers didn't. Materials that came from the bodies of executed criminals. Now this is where it gets dark. Medieval medicine believed that certain parts of executed criminals had powerful healing properties. Blood from a freshly executed person was thought to cure epilepsy. Fat rendered from executed bodies was used to treat joint pain, broken bones, and arthritis. Even moss that grew on the skulls of hanged criminals was considered medicinal. This belief system is called corpse medicine, or medicinal cannibalism, and it was widely practiced in medieval and early modern Europe. And who had access to these materials? The executioners. They were the ones handling the bodies, disposing of them, and in the process, harvesting these supposedly valuable substances. Franz Schmidt definitely practiced this type of medicine. Historical records show executioners selling these materials, both openly and covertly. It was a significant source of income, and people bought them, desperately. Because if you're suffering from epilepsy, if your child is dying, you'll try anything, even medicine derived from executed criminals. But executioners weren't just harvesting body parts. They were also skilled in conventional treatments. They could set broken bones better than most barber surgeons. They could treat wounds, burns, and infections. They knew herbal remedies and could prepare complex medicines. Why were they so good at this? Partly because of their anatomical knowledge, but also because they had to be. Remember, after torture sessions, executioners often had to nurse prisoners back to health. They became experts at treating dislocated joints because they were the ones dislocating them in the first place. They knew how to treat burns because they knew exactly how burning damaged tissue. This created a strange situation. The executioner caused the injury during torture, then had to heal it before trial. The same hands that broke bones had to set them. This daily experience of causing and then treating injuries made executioners exceptionally skilled at emergency medicine, and medieval people knew this. They might not sit next to the executioner in church, they might not invite him to their homes, but when they were sick or injured, many would swallow their pride and seek his help. There's documentation of people travelling significant distances to consult with famous executioners known for their healing skills. Franz Schmidt's reputation as a healer spread beyond Nuremberg. People came from neighbouring towns specifically to see him, and the treatments he offered were often more effective than what university-trained physicians could provide. Physicians of that era were still working from ancient texts, using treatments based on the theory of bodily humours, prescribing bleedings and purgings that often did more harm than good. Executioners, meanwhile, were using practical knowledge based on direct observation of what actually worked. Let me give you a specific example. If you broke your arm in medieval Nuremberg, a physician might tell you that the injury was caused by an imbalance of your bodily humours and prescribe bloodletting to rebalance them. This would weaken you and do nothing for the broken bone. Franz Schmidt, on the other hand, would examine the break, determine the type of fracture, set the bone with proper alignment, splint it with carefully measured pressure, and prescribe specific herbs to reduce inflammation and pain. His approach was based on practical understanding of bone healing gained from years of experience. Which treatment would you choose? The irony is profound. The man society considered contaminated, impure, barely human, was actually more knowledgeable about human health than the respected physicians. The outcast was the expert. Now here's where the psychology gets really interesting. For executioners, healing work offered something execution never could: redemption. Every life saved was a counterweight to the lives taken. Every successful treatment was proof of their humanity, their skill, their value beyond the scaffold. Franz Schmidt seems to have genuinely cared about his healing work. His diary occasionally mentions medical treatments with a different tone than his execution entries. There's almost pride when he notes a particularly difficult case he successfully treated. This was work he could feel good about, work that earned him genuine gratitude rather than fear and revulsion, and patients, despite their prejudices, often developed grudging respect for executioners who healed them. You might not want to socialize with the man, but if he cured your child's illness or set your father's broken leg perfectly, you couldn't deny his skill. This created moments of genuine human connection in otherwise isolated lives. When an executioner successfully treated someone, that person had to acknowledge his humanity, his competence, his worth. For a brief moment, the social barriers came down. Some executioners leveraged their healing work to build better lives for their families. They couldn't escape the executioner label, but they could become known as skilled healers too. This dual identity gave them a bit more standing in the community. Not acceptance exactly, but a kind of wary respect. There were even cases of executioners being called to treat members of noble families or wealthy merchants. The same people who wouldn't normally acknowledge an executioner's existence would quietly send for him when someone was seriously injured or ill. Hypocrisy? Absolutely. But it also shows how desperately people needed skilled medical care, and how executioners filled that need. Think about the psychological complexity of this existence. Every morning you wake up and you're two people simultaneously. You're the feared executioner, marked and marginalized, but you're also the skilled healer, sought after and needed. You're the man who takes life and the man who saves it. You're death and life in one body. How do you reconcile that? How do you hold both identities without going mad? Maybe you compartmentalize completely, keeping the two roles separate. Maybe you see them as connected, understanding death so you can better preserve life. Maybe you focus on the healing to balance out the killing, seeking redemption through medicine. Different executioners probably handled it differently. But the fact that so many executioners became skilled healers suggests it fulfilled some psychological need. It gave them a way to be more than just instruments of death. It let them contribute positively to their communities, even if those communities never fully accepted them. There's something deeply human in this. The need to heal, to help, to preserve life, even when your job requires you to end it. The desire to be known for something good, even when you're famous for something terrible. The hope that your healing work might somehow balance out the harm you've done. And in Franz Schmidt's case, it worked. When he finally retired and petitioned to free his children from the executioner's curse, authorities granted his request partly because of his healing work. His medical contributions gave him standing, gave him leverage, gave him a reason to be respected despite his profession. His children were freed. They didn't have to become executioners. They could pursue normal trades, normal lives, normal marriages, and that freedom came, at least in part, because Franz had healed 15,000 people. Because he'd proven that an executioner could be more than just death. The story of executioners as healers reminds us that humans are rarely just one thing. We're complex, contradictory, capable of both terrible and beautiful acts. The hands that kill can also heal. The mind that understands death can also preserve life. The person society rejects can be the person society needs most. Next, we're exploring power and wealth, because here's something that might surprise you. Some executioners became quite rich. Despite the social ostracism, despite the stigma, the financial reality of being an executioner could actually be quite good. We'll look at how executioners accumulated wealth, what they did with it, and why money couldn't buy them the one thing they wanted most: acceptance. It's a story about the limits of wealth and the price of exclusion. Stay with me. There's a strange truth about medieval executioners that doesn't quite fit our image of them as society's lowest outcasts. Many of them were rich, not comfortable, not getting by, rich. Some executioners accumulated enough wealth to rival successful merchants. They owned large houses, employed servants, lived in material comfort that most medieval people could only dream of. But here's the cruel twist. All that money couldn't buy them the one thing they wanted most. They couldn't purchase respect. They couldn't purchase acceptance. They couldn't purchase normal lives for their children. Wealth and exclusion existed side by side, creating one of the most bitter ironies of medieval society. Let's talk about how executioners made their money, because it's more complex and interesting than you might think. First, there was the salary from their official position. Royal executioners, those employed by kings or major cities, could earn very generous annual salaries, amounts that would place them comfortably in the middle to upper middle class. The position of executioner of Paris came with a salary equivalent to a very comfortable income today, but the salary was just the beginning. The real money came from multiple income streams layered on top of each other. Executions themselves often came with per-job payments. A simple hanging might pay a certain amount. A more complex execution, like beheading or breaking on the wheel, would pay more. High-profile executions, especially of nobility or notorious criminals, could come with substantial bonuses. When Charles-Henri Sanson executed King Louis XVI, he was compensated handsomely for that momentous act. Then there were the tax exemptions. This is where it gets really interesting. Many executioner positions came with exemption from most taxes that ordinary citizens had to pay. No head tax, No property tax, no military contributions, no excise taxes on meat and alcohol. Depending on the location, executioners might be exempt from nearly all the financial burdens that made medieval life expensive. Think about what this means. An ordinary merchant might earn good money, but then lose a huge chunk to various taxes and fees. The executioner earns his salary and keeps almost all of it. It's like having a built-in salary increase of 30 to 50% compared to other professions. And then there were the side businesses we've discussed. Knacker work, rendering animal carcasses and selling the materials. Torture sessions paid separately from executions. Taxing prostitutes and lepers, keeping a portion collected. Managing gaming houses which came with fees. Cleaning cesspools which paid well because no one else wanted to do it. And the healing work. Medical consultations brought steady income. Franz Schmidt's 15,000 patients over his career meant 15,000 consultations, many of them paid. Setting bones, treating illnesses, preparing medicines, all generated income. But there was another source darker and more controversial, selling materials from executed criminals. Executioners had exclusive access to these materials, and people desperately wanted them. Blood, fat, bone fragments, even ropes used in hangings were considered to have magical or medicinal properties. An executioner could sell these items for significant profit. A vial of blood from a freshly executed criminal might sell for the equivalent of several days' wages for a labourer. A piece of hanging rope was thought to bring good luck. Human fat rendered from executed bodies was expensive and in demand. This created a macabre but lucrative trade. The executioner was literally profiting from death in multiple ways. Add all these income sources together, salary plus per-job payments plus tax exemptions plus multiple side businesses plus medical practice plus selling body parts. It's remarkable how many income streams converged on this one despised profession. Franz Schmidt became wealthy enough to own a substantial house in Nuremberg. He employed servants. He lived comfortably. By retirement, he had enough money to spend his final years without financial worries. Jean-Guillaume, the patriarch of that French executioner dynasty, became wealthy enough to afford an elaborate funeral. His descendants accumulated even more wealth over their century of service. The Sanson family became genuinely prosperous. They owned property, lived well, had financial security many respectable families lacked. So here we have these men who are social pariahs, who can't enter churches through the front door, who have their children excluded from schools, and yet financially they're better off than many of the people who look down on them. Can you imagine the psychological complexity? You're wealthy enough to afford luxuries. You could, in theory, live a comfortable life. But you can't enjoy that comfort socially. You can own a big house, but you can't invite guests. You can afford fine clothes, but you still have to wear the markers of your profession. You have money, but you can't use it to buy your way into respectability. Some executioners tried. They bought the finest houses they could, furnished them lavishly, displayed their wealth ostentatiously. It was a way of saying, you can exclude me socially, but you can't deny that I've succeeded financially. Defiance expressed through material comfort, but it didn't change their fundamental status. A wealthy executioner was still an executioner. The stain of the profession couldn't be washed away by money. There are records of executioners trying to use their wealth strategically. They'd donate to churches, hoping for better treatment. They'd pay for public works, trying to earn goodwill. They'd offer medical services free to the poor, building reputations as benefactors. And sometimes this helped a little. A generous executioner might be spoken of with a bit more respect. But the fundamental barriers remained. The children of wealthy executioners still couldn't marry into respectable families. The executioner still sat alone in church. This created a strange social dynamic. Everyone knew the executioner was wealthy. Everyone knew he had financial resources. But no one could openly acknowledge it without implying that wealth might make the executioner somehow more acceptable. And that would undermine the entire social system that kept executioners marginalized. So you had this unspoken arrangement. The executioner could be wealthy, could live comfortably, but had to remain socially invisible. His money was real, but his social status was fixed. Think about what this teaches us about wealth and social status. We often assume they go together, that having money automatically brings respect. The medieval executioner proves that's not always true. You can have wealth without status. You can have financial security without social acceptance. Money is just money. It doesn't change who you are in society's eyes. And for executioners, this created a particular kind of bitterness. They were doing work society needed. They were doing it well enough to accumulate significant wealth. But society still treated them as less than human. Some executioners became angry about this. There are historical accounts of executioners who turned bitter, who used their position to abuse others, who took out their frustration on the criminals and outcasts they had power over. When you're wealthy but still treated like garbage, that anger has to go somewhere. Others accepted it with resigned pragmatism. Fine, society doesn't accept us, but we'll take the money, provide for our families, and build the best lives we can within these constraints. Franz Schmidt seems to have taken this approach. He accumulated wealth, used it wisely, and ultimately used it as leverage to free his children from the profession. And that's perhaps the most important thing wealth could buy for an executioner: options for the next generation. If you were poor and an executioner, your children had no choice. They'd become executioners too. But if you were wealthy, you could petition authorities. You could offer inducements. You could argue that your financial contributions to the community earned your family a chance at redemption. Franz Schmidt's wealth was part of what enabled him to successfully petition for his children's release from the executioner's curse. He could point to his substantial contributions to Nuremberg's well-being. Money didn't buy his children's freedom directly, but it provided the foundation for that freedom. So in the end, wealth did matter for executioners. Not because it brought them social acceptance in their own lifetimes, but because it gave them the means to change their families' futures. The paradox of the wealthy executioner tells us something profound about power and privilege in any society. You can have one without the other. Financial power doesn't automatically translate to social power. And sometimes the people society most despises are also the people quietly accumulating wealth, while everyone's looking down on them. Medieval executioners were powerful in ways that weren't immediately visible. They had financial power. They had the power of life and death on the scaffold. They had power over information gained through their various roles. They had the power that comes from being needed, even if you're not wanted. But they couldn't convert those forms of power into the one thing they truly wanted: simple acceptance, simple dignity, the right to walk through a town square without people turning away, the right to have their children play with other children, the right to be seen as human beings rather than symbols of death. And that's perhaps the saddest part of the executioner's story. They could succeed by every financial measure and still be treated as failures of humanity. They could accumulate wealth, heal thousands, serve faithfully for decades, and still die as outcasts. Up next, we're exploring something that brings all these threads together: the famous executioners who became legendary figures in their own right. We'll look at the individuals whose names survived history, whose stories were remembered, who somehow transcended the typical executioner's anonymity. These were men whose reputations, for better or worse, made them historical figures. Their stories reveal the full range of what an executioner could be: professional, infamous, skilled, cruel, human. Stay with me as we meet the executioners history couldn't forget. Most executioners lived and died in relative anonymity. They did their work, collected their pay, and faded from history. But some executioners became famous, even legendary. Their names survived the centuries. Their stories were told and retold. They became more than just functionaries of death. They became symbols, characters in history's grand narrative. Why did some executioners become famous while others were forgotten? Sometimes it was because of their skill, sometimes because of their cruelty, sometimes because of the historical moment they inhabited, the famous people they executed, and sometimes, honestly, because of their flair for drama. Let me introduce you to some of the executioners history couldn't forget. Let's start with Jan Miedelaars, the executioner of Prague. If ever an executioner understood the power of image, it was Jan. He wore a specially crafted red hood that covered his entire face, bright red, unmistakable. When Jan Miedelaars appeared in that red hood, you knew death had arrived. This wasn't just practical anonymity. This was theatre. The red hood became Jan's signature, his brand. People talked about the man in the red hood. He became a figure of legend even in his own lifetime. Children were scared into good behaviour with threats that the red-hooded man would come for them. But Jan Miedelaars is most famous for one extraordinary day. June 21st, 1621, the Old Town Square in Prague, 27 leaders of the Bohemian Revolt were to be executed in a single day. 27 executions, one executioner. Think about that for a moment. 27 beheadings in one day. That's not just physically exhausting, that's psychologically overwhelming. 27 people, lined up, waiting their turn, watching the ones before them die, knowing they're next. Jan Miedelaars performed all 27 executions with his characteristic red hood and professional efficiency. It took hours. The square ran with blood. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the red-hooded figure worked methodically through the condemned, one after another after another. This mass execution was meant to terrify the population, to demonstrate the consequences of rebellion, and it worked. But it also made Jan Miedelaars infamous. He became a symbol of Habsburg power and cruelty. His red hood appeared in nightmares and folk tales. He was the boogeyman made real. The irony is that Jan was just doing his job. He didn't start the rebellion. He didn't decide the sentences. He was the instrument, not the cause. But history remembers instruments when they're wielded dramatically enough. And Jan Miedelaars, in his red hood, executing 27 men in one day, was nothing if not dramatic. Now let's talk about someone we've mentioned before, but whose story deserves deeper exploration. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner of Paris who beheaded a king. Charles-Henri came from that dynasty of executioners we discussed. By the time he took the position, the Sanson family had been executioners of Paris for generations. But Charles-Henri's career coincided with the most turbulent period in French history, the French Revolution. Imagine being an executioner during the Revolution. Suddenly you're not just executing common criminals, you're executing aristocrats, priests, revolutionaries who fell out of favour, and eventually even the leaders of the revolution itself. You're at the centre of history's storm, and your job is to kill its major players. Charles-Henri executed King Louis XVI on January 21, 1793. The crowd was enormous. The tension was incredible. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and France could have erupted into civil war right there. But Charles-Henri was a professional. He'd advocated for the use of the guillotine specifically because it was more reliable than the axe or sword. No human error, no botched executions, just a mechanical blade falling with perfect consistency. The execution of Louis was followed by the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette. Then came the Terror, when Charles-Henri executed hundreds upon hundreds of people in a rapid succession. Day after day the guillotine operated, and Charles-Henri Sanson was there, the constant figure overseeing the machinery of revolutionary justice. He executed nearly 3,000 people over his career. 3,000. And he did it during a period when the entire social order was being torn down and rebuilt. The very people who had looked down on executioners as impure were now being executed by one. The revolution, in its way, proved that everyone was equal under the blade. But here's what's fascinating about Charles-Henri Sanson. He seems to have been conflicted about his role in the revolution. There are accounts suggesting he was troubled by the sheer scale of killing, that he performed his duties mechanically, professionally, but without enthusiasm. He was caught between his professional obligation and his personal horror at what was happening. After the terror ended, Charles-Henri continued as executioner, but he'd seen too much. He'd killed a king and queen. He'd killed revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. He'd killed moderates and extremists. He'd been the constant instrument in a period of extraordinary violence. When Charles-Henri Sanson died, he was remembered not just as an executioner, but as a witness to history. His hands had literally shaped the revolution. He was the person who made the terror possible through his technical competence, and that's a heavy legacy to bear. Now let me tell you about a very different kind of famous executioner, Albert Pierrepoint of Britain. Albert worked in the 20th century, long after the medieval period, but his story reveals something important about how the profession evolved and what it meant to be known as a master of execution. Albert came from that British Pierrepoint dynasty. His father and uncle were both executioners, but Albert became the most famous of them all because of his extraordinary professionalism and his conflicted relationship with capital punishment. Albert Pierrepoint executed over 400 people during his career from 1932 to 1956. He became known as the fastest executioner in British history. He could have a person from cell to death in under 10 seconds. 10 seconds. That's not cruelty. That's efficiency carried to its absolute limit, meant to minimize suffering. Albert took pride in this speed. He saw it as mercy. The condemned person had less time to be afraid, less time to suffer, quick, precise, professional. Albert embodied the idea that if society is going to execute people, it should at least do it as humanely as possible. But here's the remarkable part. Later in life, Albert Pierrepoint became an opponent of capital punishment. The man who'd executed over 400 people came to believe that execution was wrong. He wrote, "I do not now believe that any one of the hundreds of executions I carried out has in any way acted as a deterrent against future murder. Capital punishment, in my view, achieved nothing except revenge." Think about that statement. A master executioner famous for his skill saying that everything he'd done achieved nothing except revenge. It's a profound rejection of his own life's work. Albert's story shows us that even the most professional, most skilled executioners were still human beings capable of doubt, growth, and change. He wasn't a monster. He was a man doing a job, and eventually that job forced him to confront deep questions about justice, punishment, and the value of human life. These famous executioners, Jan Middelage, Charles-Henri Sanson, Albert Pierrepoint, they represent different faces of the profession. Jan with his theatrical red hood and mass execution, Charles-Henri witnessing and enabling revolution, Albert achieving peak efficiency and then rejecting it all. But they all shared something. They became more than just executioners. They became symbols, representatives of their times, figures through which we can understand larger historical forces. And that's true even of Franz Schmidt, whose diary we've discussed. Franz became famous not through theatrical displays or revolutionary executions, but through his meticulous record-keeping. His diary made him immortal in a way his executions never could have. He gave us a window into the executioner's world that no one else provided. These men's legacies raise interesting questions. Should we remember executioners? Are they historical figures worth studying, or are they just footnotes, instruments of systems larger than themselves? I think they're worth remembering precisely because they were instruments. They show us what societies ask people to do. They reveal the machinery of justice and power. They demonstrate the psychological cost of being the person who does society's dirty work. And their fame, or infamy, shows us what captures historical imagination. We remember the Red Hood. We remember the execution of a king. We remember the man who executed 400 people and then said it was all wrong. These stories stick with us because they're dramatic, yes, but also because they're deeply human. They're about people trying to do impossible jobs, trying to maintain their humanity while acting as instruments of death, trying to make sense of their place in history. Next, we're going to shift to something that connects past to present. How the role of executioner evolved and eventually disappeared in most of the world. We'll explore the movement away from public executions, the debates about capital punishment, the changing technologies of death, and ultimately the abolition of the executioner's role in much of Europe. It's a story about how societies grapple with punishment, how they decide who has the right to take life, and how even the most entrenched institutions can change. Stay with me as we trace the executioner's path to obsolescence. For centuries, the executioner was a permanent fixture in European society, as inevitable as taxes, as certain as death itself. Every town needed one. Every legal system depended on one. The profession seemed eternal, unchangeable, as much a part of civilization as judges or soldiers, and then, slowly, quietly, it began to disappear. The decline of the executioner happened over centuries and unfolded differently across Europe. It wasn't a single moment of abolition, but a gradual erosion of the profession, driven by changing attitudes, technological innovations, and evolving ideas about justice and human dignity. Let's start with one of the first major shifts, the movement from public to private executions. For most of history, executions were public spectacles. Remember all those crowds we discussed? Executions were meant to be seen, to deter crime through fear, to demonstrate state power through visible violence. The executioner performed on a public stage, and the audience was essential to the performance. But starting in the 18th century, that began to change. Intellectuals and reformers started questioning whether public executions actually deterred crime, or just brutalized society. They noticed something disturbing. Crowds at executions weren't always solemn and respectful. Sometimes they were carnival-like. People drank, joked, treated execution days like festivals. Even worse, public executions sometimes created sympathy for the condemned. If the person showed courage, if they gave a moving final speech, the crowd might turn against the authorities. The spectacle that was supposed to reinforce power sometimes undermined it. So governments began moving executions behind walls. In Britain, the last public execution was in 1868. After that, executions happened inside prisons, witnessed only by officials and invited observers. No more crowds, no more public spectacle, just quiet, private death. This fundamentally changed the executioner's role. They were no longer performers managing crowds. They became prison functionaries, carrying out sentences in relative privacy. The theatrical element disappeared. The social visibility that had defined the profession vanished. And here's what's interesting. When executions moved behind prison walls, the stigma attached to executioners began to fade slightly. In Britain, 20th century executioners like the Pierrepoints were known publicly, but weren't ostracized the way medieval executioners had been. They were civil servants doing an unpleasant but legal job. The second major change came from technology. The invention of the guillotine in 1789 was revolutionary, literally and figuratively. For the first time, you had a machine that could execute people without requiring skill from the executioner. The guillotine was designed to be egalitarian and humane. Everyone, regardless of social class, would die the same way, and the death would be instantaneous, painless, achieved by mechanical precision rather than human hand. But think about what this meant for executioners. Their skill, their years of training, their hard-won expertise in using the sword or axe suddenly became obsolete. Anyone could pull the lever that released the guillotine blade. The executioner was reduced to a machine operator. In Britain, they developed the long drop method of hanging in 1872. This technique, when done correctly, broke the neck instantly, causing immediate unconsciousness and death. It was considered more humane than the old suspension hanging that killed by slow strangulation. But again, it reduced the executioner's role. Calculate the drop distance based on the person's weight, position the noose correctly, pull the lever. It was more science than art, more procedure than skill. These technological changes were driven by a desire for more humane execution. But they also depersonalized death. The executioner became less important, less individual. The machine, the procedure, the system took precedence over the person. The third major shift came from changing attitudes about capital punishment itself. The abolition movement began gaining strength in the 19th century, driven by religious groups, humanitarian reformers, and intellectuals who questioned the state's right to take life. Some countries abolished capital punishment entirely. The Netherlands abolished it in 1870, Portugal in 1867, though it had effectively stopped using it decades earlier, Norway in 1875, Italy in 1894. These weren't just suspensions. These were permanent abolitions, declarations that the state had no right to kill its citizens. Other countries kept capital punishment but used it less and less. Executions became rare events rather than regular occurrences. The executioner went from being busy to being almost idle. In many places the position became part-time or was eliminated entirely, with prison guards carrying out the occasional execution when needed. France kept the guillotine until 1977. The last person executed by guillotine in France was a man named Hamida Jandoubi, executed on September 10, 1977. After that, France abolished capital punishment entirely in 1981. Marcel Chevalier, France's last official executioner, retired with the abolition. Think about what that means. A profession that had existed for centuries, that had been essential to every judicial system, simply ceased to exist. The executioner became obsolete, a relic of a bygone era. Britain abolished capital punishment for murder in 1965, though it kept it for treason and a few other crimes until 1998. The last executions in Britain were in 1964. After that, the Pierrepoint legacy ended. The executioner's profession, which had been passed down through families for generations, simply stopped. But here's a question worth pondering. Did the executioner really disappear, or did they just transform? In countries that still practice capital punishment, someone still has to carry out executions. In the United States, that role is filled by prison staff, medical personnel in the case of lethal injection, or members of a firing squad. These people aren't called executioners. They're wardens, corrections officers, medical technicians. But functionally, they're doing the same thing medieval executioners did, ending lives on behalf of the state. The difference is anonymity. Modern executioners are shielded by institutions, by privacy, by collective responsibility. In lethal injection, one person inserts the IV, another activates the drugs, often with a system where multiple people press buttons, but only one actually triggers the lethal dose. This diffuses responsibility, lets everyone involved say they might not have been the actual executioner. Medieval executioners couldn't hide like that. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone knew what they did. They bore the full weight of their actions, the full stigma, the full responsibility. So in some ways we've become more sophisticated about execution. We've removed the public spectacle. We've medicalized it, bureaucratized it, made it clean and private. But we haven't necessarily made it more honest. We've just made it easier for everyone involved to avoid confronting what's actually happening. The abolition of capital punishment across much of Europe represented a fundamental shift in how societies thought about justice, punishment, and human rights. It reflected growing belief that state-sanctioned killing was itself a crime, that societies could maintain order without resorting to execution, that rehabilitation was possible and preferable to elimination. This movement was driven by people who looked at centuries of executions and asked, did any of this make us safer? Did it deter crime? Did it serve justice? And increasingly, the answer was no. Albert Pierrepoint, master executioner, reached that conclusion from direct experience. Reformers reached it from philosophy and observation, but they reached the same place. Execution doesn't work, and we should stop doing it. The decline of the executioner is in many ways a story about moral progress, about societies deciding that some things, no matter how traditional, no matter how established, are simply wrong, that the state shouldn't be in the business of taking lives, even criminal lives. But it's also a story about loss. Not the loss of execution itself, which most of us wouldn't mourn, but the loss of visibility, the loss of honest confrontation with what we're doing. When executioners were public figures, when executions were public events, society had to face the reality of state violence. It was ugly, brutal, impossible to ignore. Now, in countries that still execute, it happens behind prison walls, sanitized, medicalized, hidden from view. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to confront it. The executioner, even when they still exist in function, has become invisible. The medieval executioner, for all their faults, for all the brutality they represented, at least made death visible. They forced society to acknowledge what it was doing. They stood on the scaffold in daylight and owned their role. There's a kind of honesty in that, however uncomfortable. The disappearance of the executioner as a profession marks the end of an era when justice was bloody, visible and personal, when someone had to look the condemned in the eye and end their life with their own hands, when society's violence was embodied in a single identifiable person who bore the burden for everyone else. That era is gone, for better and for worse. The executioner has joined the ranks of obsolete professions, the knocker-upper who woke people before alarm clocks, the lamplighter who lit street lamps before electricity, the town crier who spread news before newspapers. All victims of progress, all made unnecessary by changes in society and technology. But unlike those other professions, the executioner leaves us with profound questions. Questions about justice, about punishment, about who has the right to take life and under what circumstances. Questions we're still wrestling with today. Coming up in our final sections, we're going to reflect on what the executioner's story teaches us about human nature and society. We'll explore the lessons we can draw from this dark profession, what it reveals about how we construct social hierarchies, how we handle necessary but unpleasant work, how we balance individual humanity against social roles, and we'll consider why, centuries after the executioner's heyday, we're still fascinated by these figures of death and justice. Stay with me for the conclusion of this journey. We've travelled through centuries of executioner history. We've met men who killed and healed, who accumulated wealth yet died as outcasts, who carried out society's darkest work while living on its margins. Now it's time to ask, what does all of this mean? What can the executioner's story teach us about ourselves, about society, about human nature? The first and perhaps most important lesson is this: societies need scapegoats. They need someone to embody the unpleasant aspects of social order, someone to carry the moral burden so everyone else can feel clean. Think about what medieval society did with the executioner. They created a position that was absolutely necessary for their legal system to function. Without executioners, there could be no capital punishment, no corporal punishment, no enforcement of the most serious laws. The executioner was essential, but having created this essential position, society then punished the person who filled it. They marked him, excluded him, treated him as contaminated. Why? Because by placing all the impurity, all the moral taint of state violence onto one person, everyone else could feel pure. The judge could sentence someone to death and go home feeling he'd done justice, not committed violence. The crowd could witness an execution and tell themselves they were just spectators, not participants. The whole system of execution could operate, and the only person who bore the full moral weight was the executioner. This is scapegoating at its most efficient. One person carries the sin so the system can function without guilt. It's psychologically convenient for everyone except the scapegoat. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We still do this today. We've just gotten more sophisticated about it. Think about modern professions that involve unpleasant but necessary work. Slaughterhouse workers who kill animals so we can eat meat, but whom we prefer not to think about. Waste management workers who handle our garbage and sewage, essential to public health but socially invisible. Prison guards who manage violent criminals, doing dangerous work that most people don't want to acknowledge. These workers aren't marked with physical brands or forced to live on town outskirts, but they often face social stigma, low status despite decent pay, and a kind of deliberate forgetting by the rest of society. We need what they do, but we don't want to think about it or honour them for it. The executioner's story teaches us to recognise this pattern. When we find someone doing necessary but unpleasant work and we look down on them for it, we're continuing the same dynamic medieval societies practiced with executioners. We're creating scapegoats to carry our moral discomfort. The second lesson is about the complexity of human identity. Remember Franz Schmidt? Executioner and healer, killer and lifesaver. How do we make sense of that? We want people to be simple. We want the villain to be purely villainous, the hero to be purely heroic. But real people are complicated. Franz executed 361 people and healed 15,000. Which number defines him? Both do, neither does. He was both things simultaneously. This challenges our need for simple categories. Was Franz a good person or a bad person? The question itself is inadequate. He was a person who did terrible things and wonderful things, who took lives and saved lives, who existed in profound moral contradiction. And honestly, most of us exist in some version of that contradiction, just not as dramatically. We're capable of kindness and cruelty. We can be generous to some people while ignoring the suffering of others. We can do good work that has harmful consequences, or do harmful work that has good outcomes. The executioner forces us to confront human moral complexity. These weren't monsters. They were people, doing an impossible job, trying to find meaning and dignity in circumstances that denied them both. Some succeeded, like Franz who freed his children. Some failed and became bitter and cruel, most probably fell somewhere in between. The third lesson is about power and status, and how they don't always align. The executioner had considerable power over life and death, power over information, financial power through multiple income streams, power that came from being needed even while being unwanted, but they had almost no status. Status is about where you stand in social hierarchies, how you're perceived, whether you're respected. And executioners, despite their power, were at the bottom of the status hierarchy. This teaches us that power and status can be separated. In modern society, we often assume they go together. We assume powerful people have high status and vice versa. But that's not always true. There are people with enormous power who lack social status, and people with high status who lack real power. Understanding this separation helps us see social structures more clearly. It reveals that status is often about perception, about collective agreement to honor or dishonor certain roles, while power is about actual capability to affect outcomes. The fourth lesson is about the cost of exclusion, both to the excluded and to society. When medieval society excluded executioners, forcing them to marry only each other, live in designated areas, carry visible markers of their profession, what did this achieve? It didn't make executions more ethical. It didn't make the justice system better. It didn't reduce crime. All it did was create hereditary dynasties of executioners, families trapped in a profession they couldn't escape, children marked from birth for a life of exclusion. This generational trauma, this inherited stigma, shows the cruelty of rigid social hierarchies. The executioner's child didn't choose their parents' profession. They hadn't done anything wrong. But they were punished anyway, excluded anyway, stigmatized anyway, and society lost out too. How many potential artists, scholars, craftsmen, leaders were trapped in the executioner's role because of the accident of their birth? How much human potential was wasted because social structures were more important than the individual capability? This lesson applies to any system of inherited status or stigma. When we judge people based on who their parents were, what family they came from, what circumstances they were born into, we create the same injustice. We trap people in roles and deny them the chance to be who they might become. The fifth lesson is about witness and memory. Franz Schmidt's diary survived. Because it did, we know details about medieval execution that we wouldn't otherwise have. We have a window into that world, that profession, that experience. Most executioners left no records. They died and were forgotten, their experiences lost. But Franz wrote it down. He bore witness, and centuries later, his witness teaches us. This reminds us of the importance of documentation, of recording experiences, especially difficult or stigmatized experiences. The stories that seem shameful or uncomfortable or unimportant in the moment may be the stories that teach the most valuable lessons later. Who in our society is living experiences that need to be recorded? Whose stories are we losing because those people are stigmatized or ignored? What will future generations wish we had documented about our time? The sixth lesson is about change and progress. For centuries, the executioner seemed eternal, unchangeable. The profession was as fixed as the seasons, and then it disappeared. This teaches us that even the most entrenched institutions, even the most seemingly permanent social structures can change, can end, can be recognized as wrong and abandoned. That's hopeful. It means that injustices we see today that seem immovable, that appear to be permanent features of human society, might not be. They might be like the executioner, seemingly eternal, actually temporary. The abolition of capital punishment across most of Europe happened because people decided it was wrong and worked to change it. It took time. It took effort. It took moral courage to stand up and say that a practice endorsed by religion, tradition, and authority was nonetheless wrong. But it happened, and it teaches us that moral progress is possible, not inevitable, not easy, but possible. The seventh lesson is about fascination and fear. Why are we still talking about executioners centuries after most of them disappeared? Why does this topic fascinate us? Partly because executioners lived at the boundary between life and death, between law and violence, between civilization and barbarity. They occupied a liminal space that both attracts and repels us. We want to understand what it's like to live in that space, to be that person. But also, I think, because the executioner represents something we recognize in ourselves, the capacity to do terrible things when it's our job, the ability to rationalize violence when it's sanctioned by authority, the willingness to exclude and stigmatize others to protect our own sense of purity. The executioner is disturbing not because they're alien to us, but because they're familiar. They show us aspects of human nature and social organization that we'd rather not acknowledge. They're a mirror, and what we see in that mirror makes us uncomfortable. But discomfort can be valuable. It can prompt reflection, growth, change. By studying the executioner, by understanding their role, their experience, their humanity, we learn about ourselves, about our capacity for cruelty and compassion, about how we construct social hierarchies and moral boundaries, about how we handle necessary but unpleasant aspects of civilization. The executioner's story is dark, yes. It's full of violence, stigma, suffering, but it's also full of humanity. Franz healing 15,000 people, executioners fighting to free their children from the profession, Albert Pierrepoint rejecting capital punishment after executing 400 people. These moments of moral clarity, of resistance against injustice, of human dignity maintained in degrading circumstances, these matter too. They teach us that even in the darkest roles, even in the most compromised positions, human beings can strive for something better, can question, can resist, can change. And they teach us that societies can learn, can evolve, can recognize their mistakes and do better. The profession of executioner is largely gone now. That's progress. Not perfect progress, not complete progress, but progress nonetheless. In our final section, we're going to bring all of these threads together and reflect on why this history matters now, in our modern world. We'll consider how understanding the executioner helps us understand current social issues, how these medieval stories illuminate contemporary challenges, and what we should remember from this journey through one of history's darkest professions. Stay with me as we conclude this exploration. So here we are, at the end of a long journey through one of history's darkest professions. We've walked alongside executioners from medieval town squares to revolutionary scaffolds, from torture chambers to healing rooms, from public spectacles to private obsolescence. We've met men who killed and healed, who accumulated wealth yet died as outcasts, who bore impossible burdens in impossible circumstances. But why does any of this matter now? Why spend hours learning about a profession that barely exists anymore, about social structures that seem alien to our modern world, about people who lived and died centuries ago? The answer, I think, is that the executioner's story is ultimately about us, about human nature, about how societies organize themselves, how they deal with violence, how they create meaning and maintain order. The medieval executioner is gone, but the forces that created them, the dynamics they embodied, the questions they raise, these are still with us. Let me share what I think is the most important takeaway from this entire story. Every society needs someone to do its unpleasant work. Every civilization requires people to handle death, waste, violence, all the things that keep society functioning but that we'd rather not think about. The question isn't whether these jobs will exist. The question is, how do we treat the people who do them? Medieval society chose stigmatization. They marked executioners, excluded them, treated them as less than human, and in doing so they created hereditary dynasties of suffering, trapped families in degradation, wasted human potential. We can do better. We can recognize that necessary work deserves respect, regardless of how unpleasant it is. We can honor the people who do difficult jobs rather than looking down on them. We can refuse to create scapegoats to carry our collective moral burden. This isn't just abstract philosophy. This has practical implications right now, today. There are people in our society doing work that's essential but stigmatized. Caring for the dying, cleaning up after disasters, managing our waste, dealing with violence and trauma. These people deserve our respect and support, not our disdain or deliberate forgetting. The executioner's story teaches us to notice these people, to value them, to refuse to participate in the scapegoating dynamic that medieval society perfected. The second major takeaway is about complexity and nuance. Franz Schmidt executed 361 people and healed 15,000. He was simultaneously an instrument of death and a preserver of life. He contained multitudes. We live in an era that often demands simple narratives. We want clear heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. But real human beings are complicated. Real moral situations are ambiguous. Real history resists simple categorization. The executioner forces us to sit with that complexity, to acknowledge that people can do terrible things and wonderful things, that systems can be simultaneously necessary and unjust, that progress can come with loss. Learning to hold that complexity, to resist the urge to simplify, to sit with moral ambiguity without losing our ethical bearings, this is crucial for navigating our own complicated world. The third takeaway is about change and agency. For centuries, the executioner seemed like a permanent feature of civilization, an unchangeable reality. And then people decided it was wrong and worked to abolish it. This teaches us something powerful about human agency and moral progress. The things that seem most fixed, most eternal, most impossible to change, they can change. They have changed. They will change again. Right now, there are injustices in our world that seem immovable. Systems that seem too big to reform. Practices that seem too entrenched to abandon. The executioner's story reminds us that this apparent permanence is an illusion. Change is possible. It requires courage, persistence, moral clarity. But it's possible. What are the executioners of our time? What institutions or practices will future generations look back on with horror, wondering how we tolerated them? What social structures will they find as alien and unjust, as we find the medieval executioner's hereditary stigma? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're worth asking, because recognizing injustice is the first step toward changing it. The fourth takeaway is about memory and witness. Franz Schmidt wrote down his experiences. Because he did, we know things about medieval execution that we wouldn't otherwise know. His act of documentation, of bearing witness, teaches us centuries later. Who in our time is documenting experiences that need to be recorded? Whose stories are being told and whose are being lost? What will future generations wish we had preserved? This is a call to pay attention, to listen to voices that are marginalized or ignored, to preserve experiences even when they're uncomfortable or unpopular. The stories that seem least important in the moment may be the stories that teach the most valuable lessons later. And finally, perhaps the most personal takeaway, the executioner's story reminds us of our shared humanity. These were people living in extreme circumstances, bearing burdens we can barely imagine, trying to find meaning and dignity in situations that denied them both, and they were still recognizably human. They loved their families, they took pride in their skills, they tried to do their jobs well, they hoped for better futures for their children, they questioned their roles, they changed their minds, they grew. In all their complexity and all their moral ambiguity, they were human, just like us. And if we can recognize their humanity, even across centuries, even across such different circumstances, maybe we can recognize the humanity in people around us now. People doing difficult work, people in stigmatized roles, people living in circumstances we don't understand. The executioner teaches us to look past labels, past roles, past social markers, and see the person underneath. To recognize that everyone is carrying burdens we know nothing about, that everyone is more complex than their job title or social status suggests. This journey through executioner history has been dark at times. We've confronted violence, stigma, suffering, death, but we've also found humanity, resilience, healing, hope. We've seen people maintaining dignity in degrading circumstances. We've witnessed moral courage in impossible situations. We've traced the arc of moral progress, slow and uneven but real. And we've learned that history, even dark history, especially dark history, has lessons to teach us about ourselves, about our societies, about human nature, about how we can do better. Franz Schmidt died in 1634 at the age of 79. He'd served as executioner for 45 years. He'd killed 361 people and healed 15,000. He'd accumulated wealth and earned respect through his medical work. And most importantly, he'd succeeded in freeing his children from the executioner's curse. They lived normal lives, pursued normal trades, married into respectable families. In his final years, Franz wasn't known primarily as an executioner. He was known as Master Franz, the healer, the man who had helped so many people, the skilled physician with the unusual past. That transformation, from executioner to Master Franz, from death dealer to healer, from cursed to respected, represents a kind of redemption. Not complete, not perfect, but real. And maybe that's the most hopeful part of this entire story. That change is possible, that redemption is possible, that people and societies can learn, grow, evolve, that we're not trapped by our pasts or our mistakes, that with courage and persistence, we can become something better than what we were. The medieval executioner is gone now, largely forgotten except in history books and stories like this one. But the questions they raise, the lessons they teach, the mirror they hold up to human nature and social organization, these remain relevant. So the next time you encounter someone doing difficult, stigmatized work, remember the executioner. Remember that societies create scapegoats to carry their moral burdens and refuse to participate. Recognize the dignity in necessary work. Honor the people who do what needs to be done. The next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their role or label, remember Franz Schmidt. Remember that people are more complex than their jobs, that everyone contains multitudes, that humanity persists even in the darkest circumstances, and the next time something seems impossible to change, remember that the profession of executioner, which existed for centuries across all of Europe, which seemed as permanent as the seasons, eventually disappeared because people decided it was wrong and worked to end it. Change is possible. Progress is possible. We're not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. We can learn. We can do better. That's what the executioner's story ultimately teaches us. In all its darkness, in all its complexity, in all its uncomfortable truth, it teaches us about human potential, for cruelty and compassion, for stigmatization and healing, for maintaining unjust systems and for dismantling them. The choice, as always, is ours. Thank you for staying with me through this long, dark journey into one of history's most fascinating and disturbing professions. Thank you for sitting with the discomfort, for engaging with the complexity, for thinking deeply about what this story means. I hope you found something valuable in these hours we've spent together. Something that makes you think differently about history, about society, about the people around you. Something that stays with you and changes how you see the world, even just a little bit. History is full of stories like this. Stories that challenge us, disturb us, teach us. Stories about people living in circumstances we can barely imagine, facing choices we hope we never have to make, teaching lessons across centuries. There are more stories waiting to be told, more dark corners of history to explore, more uncomfortable truths to confront, more lessons to learn. So until we meet again for the next journey into the shadows of the past, take care of yourselves. Be kind to the people doing difficult work. Question the systems that create scapegoats. Remember that everyone you meet is more complicated than they appear, and never forget that change, however impossible it seems, is always possible. The executioner's tale is finished, but the lessons continue, the questions remain, and the work of building a more just, more humane world goes on. Thank you for listening. Until next time.